We can now get started. So colleagues, welcome. This webinar is part of a weekly series. These webinars take place every Thursday at 10 a.m. They are hosted by the Vaccine Advocacy Resource Group and the African Alliance with support from the South African Medical Research Council and the Department of Science and Innovation. They are brought to you in partnership with the Community Constituency COVID-19 Front, the Treatment Action Campaign, the Advocates for the Prevention of HIV, and a range of civil society partners. On today's call, colleague, the acting CEO of the South African National AIDS Council, Ms. Nogoduka, will speak to us about the role that the South African National AIDS Council is playing in the current COVID-19 pandemic, the importance of strategic partnerships, and her thoughts on the rapidly evolving COVID-19 research and advocacy landscape, and how the Council seeks to protect the historical gains and investments made in the HIV, TB, and STI sectors. We will then also hear from Professor Jeremy Nel, who will then introduce us to the Solidarity Trial, an international clinical trial to help find an effective treatment for COVID-19, launched by the WHO and partners. The trial compares options against standard of care to assess their relative effectiveness against COVID-19. By enrolling patients in multiple countries, the Solidarity Trial aims to rapidly discover whether any of the drugs slow disease progression or improve survival. So on that note, colleagues, I'd like to welcome you again. A reminder, please put all of your questions and comments in the chat box. We will attempt to address as many of them as we can during the call. The questions we cannot get to will be included in a post-call report that will be circulated on our various social media platforms, the details of which will be shared throughout the duration of this call. So colleagues, without further ado, we will now hear from Professor Jeremy Nel, who obtained his MBCHB at the University of Cape Town. He also obtained a diploma in tropical medicine and hygiene from the Royal College of Physicians in London and recently completed a fellowship in transplant infectious diseases at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's also the co-principal investigator of the South African Solidarity Trial. For colleagues on the call, you will remember that Professor Jeremy Nel's colleague, who is also a co-principal investigator on the Solidarity Trial, is Professor Helen Rees. So together they are leading that trial. So Professor Jeremy Nel, thank you very much for joining us this morning. If you could give us an overview of the trial and then unpack for us your engagement so far with civil society, the trial's engagement with communities where solidarity is being rolled out, and what you regard as the role of advocates and civil society in supporting this trial to ensure that the trial is a success. Thank you again for joining us, and over to you.
Sure, thanks very much. I've got a few slides if you'd like, Tian. I mean, I'm happy to show just to kind of give an overview of the process. If you want that, I need to be able to share my screen. That's the only thing. Otherwise, I'm happy to just talk about it. Okay, let's get it there. So let's share screen. Beg your pardon, sorry, give me. Hopefully you can see that. All right, so
perfect. Thank you.
So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to your audience today. As Tian said, this is the Solidarity Trial. It's really aiming to see, so this is a treatment trial as opposed to a vaccine trial. It's really aiming to see if any of the promising treatments which were which were slated as possible treatments that would be effective for COVID-19 work in a way that's meaningful in a sort of not just a lab sense, but in a patient sense. In other words, does it save lives? Does it get you out of hospital quicker? Or does it prevent you requiring ventilation or intubation, so sort of critical care in COVID-19? So we know that obviously we're all familiar with SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus of causing COVID-19. And we're aware of the almost unique nature of this, that it's a pandemic, and that in a pandemic, it's really the whole world is focused on in a way the same problem, but it's also a rapidly changing field, and it really is a requirement to get as much information as we can, as rapidly as we can, so that we give the best possible care to as many people. And it has to be high quality research. And that's a really important point, because a lot of the early stuff that came out in COVID-19 was quite low quality research internationally. And it really just muddies the waters and makes it very difficult to know what works and what doesn't work. And then you end up with countries like South Africa, which is a middle income country, trying to decide whether or not to spend a lot of valuable money on therapies without being able to know whether they work or not. So this sort of high quality trial really is aiming to give answers as far as possible. And of course, though, despite the fact that we need to get answers as soon as possible, it doesn't minimize in any sense the importance of civil society. And as we've mentioned before, it really necessitates trying to engage in an innovative way. And Zoom is one of these ways, because it's difficult to go out into the community when there's lockdown, and it's certainly difficult to get even patient family involved when hospitals are not allowing families in. So it's a challenging environment, but clearly the need is there to engage with civil society, and that really implies both ways. So it's to ensure the ethical, efficient advancement of research and development, and the sort of global access to urgently identified interventions. So again, it's a sort of two-way street, and it's really aiming to make sure that the engagement strengthens the knowledge within the community that we're aiming to enroll patients from, and also that we're accountable and answer the questions that arise from these community structures in a sort of two-way dialogue. We know as well that the communities most at risk are everywhere through the world are the poorer communities. We know that this is a risk factor for bad outcomes in COVID-19 for a number of reasons, and that's obviously important that these communities must be given an important voice. And then really that, as we said, this strategically and in interesting and innovative ways to engage civil society and the community representatives to make sure that we're ethical, that we're inclusive, as efficient as possible, because we don't want to waste time or money, and in terms of getting the answers as quickly as possible for the communities which are most at risk. These are the numbers from yesterday. The large numbers. You see, we've done over 3 million tests. We've got more than 500,000 positive cases, and just short of 10,000 deaths. So it's really is. I mean, this is one of the bigger epidemics in the world, actually, with over 500,000 positive cases. Really puts us in the top 10, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of numbers in the world. So it's a big epidemic here. Where we are aiming to enroll people from is really, we made a very conscious decision to enroll from as many sites geographically as possible. And we had to stick to the big academic universities that do the teaching in medicine, for the most part at least, because they have the most trial research. And it's essential when we're trying to get something off the ground that there is some degree of expertise there, although we helping to build that expertise at each of these centers as we go as well. But you can see there really from that list, it's from multiple provinces and multiple hospitals around the country. Make sure that we're not just focusing on one particular area. These are some of the locus just to get an idea of really the breadth and the depth of the sites that we're enrolling from. So like we said, really there's just 3 big aims here. The main aim is to see if any of these medicines prevent death. The secondary objectives then is to see if they prevent you getting into ICU or requiring ventilation, or if they just shorten the duration of your time in hospital. And then, of course, the other secondary objective is to see if there's any serious adverse reactions from any of these medicines. We take anybody who's in a hospital, so we don't enroll people from outside the hospital. These must be hospitalized patients, and they must have confirmed COVID-19 infection by the test that we're doing at the time. They're all adults, they're all 18 years or older. And the patients must have no reason that we can't use any of the study drugs. And one of the critical things in this trial, actually, which I'm quite pleased about, is that we have the doctors on the grounds who are not part of the trial actually have a sort of veto power over the trial in terms of whether the patients would benefit from this, in terms of, well, rather to withdraw the patients at any time. And to see if they qualify. It's like I said, it's actually the doctors who look after the direct patients themselves rather than the trial people. And of course, the patients themselves get a massive part of it, as usual. These are the strict exclusion and inclusion criteria, but really the concept here is that they're aiming to make it easy to enroll people in this sort of study, because recognizing that it's during a pandemic, that doctors are working enormous hours, and so are the nurses around them. And it's and nonetheless, to obviously make sure that patient care and patient rights are paramount. The other important thing just to mention about the trial is that it's adaptive, and what that means is that the trial arms proceed independently, and there is an independent monitor from WHO who's the sponsor of the trial, and if they find that any particular therapy in this is either not working or that it definitively does work, this gets dropped from the trial because we don't need to study it any further. So the study changes as time goes on, and it changes in keeping with the best evidence from outside the trial and within the trial to make sure that we're really being efficient as possible with the patients that we enroll. In other words, we don't want to be enrolling people in a study, onto a drug which may not work at all. And once there's some clarity as to that, whether or not it works, that arm disappears from the trial and the other arms continue. We do take, obviously, very seriously the idea of informed consent. The patients are the first ones, and they get priority in terms of the sort of hierarchy of how you could enroll in this trial. In practice, we tend to stick with the patients and informed consent. If the patient is, say, unconscious or something, it's possible for the next of kin or relative to do it and to sign them onto the trial. It's also possible, ultimately, if that's not available for an independent clinician to the trial, to suggest that this would be useful and to give consent. But then if the patient then improves and wakes up, they can decide whether or not they want to continue with the trial or not, and how they want to withdraw. And in practice, it's really been just number one, the patient informed consent. And just to mention again the challenges of the family, of course, that by provincial policy, the families are prohibited from visiting. And that I think is changing somewhere, as it comes. But at the moment, it's really hard to get families into the hospital. And so that's been a big limitation of our ability to get any consent from the family members. But like I said, in practical terms, we've really just focused on making sure that the patients themselves are able to consent. And then, so what are we testing? So there's standard of care alone, like Tian said, and then there's one of two other options. So you can either get it randomly just with standard of care, which is all the things that we'd normally be doing for any COVID patient. And that includes things like dexamethasone, which you may have heard of, which is not part of Solidarity. That includes anticoagulation and all the sort of supportive care you'd give to any patient. But then in addition, if you're enrolled in Solidarity, you may get enrolled in either an arm that gives you Remdesivir, which I'll talk about in a second, or something called interferon beta. And these are the remaining arms. You may have heard of hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine, or Calitra, which is lopinavir, ritonavir. Those were arms that Solidarity started with internationally, but were dropped because neither of those two drugs were shown to improve outcomes. So in fact, we've never enrolled in South Africa any of the patients on those arms, because by the time we were ready to start, those arms had been dropped by Solidarity. We just keep a very sort of basic register of what the patient, the patient demographics in terms of age and sex. We have a few comorbidities that they collect in terms of data, and then the severity at admission, so whether they were on oxygen or whether they were not. And then they monitor them really just at enrollment, then during the hospitalization, and at the time the patient's ready to go home, then the trial stops for that patient. There's no monitoring afterwards, in the sense that they don't have to come back for any extra checkups or anything like that. After the study, it really just proceeds until the point at which the patient's discharged. And if the patient's discharged before they finish the course, that's fine. We don't obviously keep anyone in hospital longer than they need to be just for this Solidarity. And then just to mention briefly about PPE, because that has come up in some of the engagements. So all the people who are interacting with patients, in other words, all the trials and the trial doctors and that, are given personal protective equipment, which is appropriate according to national guidelines. And it's funded from Solidarity itself. So in other words, we don't use the hospital stock. We don't require anybody involved in the trial to buy their own PPE. We provide it as part of the trial to all the participants, to all the healthcare workers involved in the trial. And then just in terms of the patients themselves, they're able to withdraw from study treatment at any time, of course, but they can decide if they want to remain in the study and so they stop taking the drugs, but they continue to be monitored, or they can just withdraw from the study as a whole without any monitoring at any time. And that's standard practice, but we make sure that applies to the patients themselves. In practice, I will say that the patients so far have been delighted to be enrolled on the whole and have not wanted to take the drugs, but it's always an option open to them. And then briefly, like I said, in terms of follow-up, we really just want to know whether they got into ICU, how they did in terms of, how was the survival, and which drugs were given, and did they have any side effects to any of those drugs. The monitoring for this trial is done independently of WHO and independently of us. It's an independent data safety monitoring committee. There's a broad spectrum of expertise on this committee. It's infectious diseases, epidemiology, intensivists, pulmonologists, etc. And it's also, what's really nice about this is that this independent committee really has representativity from across the world, including low and middle income countries, and including specifically in Africa as well. So really do have a voice to make sure, independently of any of us who are conducting the trial, that this trial adheres to the best quality research practices. There is insurance which WHO has provided should any adverse events arise to any of the patients. But again, we're lucky a little bit in this trial that interferon beta, for example, has been around for a very long time, and we're very confident about the side effect profile. And remdesivir as well tends to be pretty safe from from the research which has been done elsewhere. So neither of these drugs which are left really are new drugs to this trial. They've all been used elsewhere before. Remdesivir is the newest one. It was used against Ebola previously. It's manufactured by Gilead, and we give it for 10 days. This drug has already been shown in other studies to reduce hospital stay, so people stay for shorter durations. But what we don't yet know, and what we're hoping to answer with Solidarity, is whether or not it reduces mortality. In other words, whether it saves lives. So this is one of the trial drugs. This drug was not available at all in the country. It's soon to be available to the private sector via generic manufacturers. But in terms of the state sector, it's the committee that decides these things decided it wasn't cost effective because it's a very expensive drug. So it remains really for the state patients, the only way to get access to this drug is through Solidarity at the moment. We of course provide it for free for the hospitals. And then interferon is the other drug. It's a drug which it's kind of immunomodulatory. It really just means it changes the immune system and makes it more aware of this virus in a way that hopefully will clear it. We give it for 6 days. We give it via injection into the skin. And then we mentioned as well about the monitoring. So we've actually added extra layers of safety monitoring to what WHO required, because we felt we wanted to be stricter about that in this country. And that's really about remdesivir. So we monitor the liver and the kidney function in accordance to best practice internationally. We do more than basically WHO required in terms of safety monitoring. And then lastly, about the data monitoring. So this data monitoring is monitored by that committee I mentioned earlier, independently of all of us. And they keep checking if the drugs show clear evidence of working, or clear evidence they don't work, or clear evidence that there's a safety problem. In other words, they're causing too many side effects in a dangerous way. Any of those three happen, they let us know independently, and then that drug is dropped from the trial either way. And that's a really important point. And then the trial can continue with the other arms, but it does not continue with the drugs where we have a clear answer for either way. So I think that's at least an overview of the trial. So just again, it's a treatment trial. It's really aiming to test one of two treatments against standard of care. And it's really aiming to see if it reduces mortality, so if it saves lives, if it saves hospital days, which is important when hospitals become overflowing, and if it saves you from getting onto a ventilator or something like that, which is really important. And then lastly as well, of course, to make sure that it looks at safety as well, and make sure that these drugs in a COVID-19 patient population are safe. In terms of the community involvement so far, of course, we've had, as you can imagine, from these sites going across the country, there are 8 different medical ethics boards which look at this because the sites are scattered around the country and under different ethics boards. Each ethics board there, I'm just going to stop sharing for now. Each ethics board there has community representation on it, as you know, and make sure we've had some positive feedback from them in terms of questions and concerns that we've addressed as we've gone along. We've also had sessions where we've involved all the community advisory boards, which for each of the sites, over 50 people, I think, where we've had kind of Zoom meetings much like this to go through the trial, explain it, and make sure that we address any concerns both during that, and then also we give people an option to send us via email any concerns that we address afterwards if they didn't feel comfortable raising it during the meeting, or if they just thought of something later. And like I said, most of that's been very positive. I think that most of the community sort of representation that we've engaged with so far has seen the value in this, and I think has been quite excited about getting access to some of these real kind of cutting edge drugs for our communities. And I think it's something just to remember is that this Remdesivir drug, for example, which is a drug that the whole world wants to get its hands on, to the degree that we've had problems even getting some of it from America, because America's deciding whether or not it wants to hoard it. But the very first person to get this, very expensive drug, it costs more than 10,000 Rand per patient. The very first person to get this drug in the country was a state patient at Helen Hospital. And I think that's, again, something I'm quite proud of, because I really wanted to make sure that we got it in the state sector before it went to the private sector. I think that's a good victory for the state sector. But we're hoping that by continuing this sort of trial, we provide access to these drugs, but we must emphasize, of course, that there are unknowns with these drugs still. If we knew that they saved lives, we wouldn't need to study them. We do need to study them in a trial setting. But really, the benefit of this sort of trials, a high quality evidence base, is that you really do get the most information possible for every patient who gets enrolled. So they really are contributing to the world's state of knowledge, and in a way that will help, I think, the whole world, but particularly, obviously, locally in South Africa and Africa. We're the only African country to participate so far, but there are many other African countries which want to participate and just are kind of getting there in terms of the sort of logistics of running it. I can tell you from first-hand experience, and Tess on the line can tell you the same. It's an enormous logistics challenge to get this sort of thing up and running. South Africa has some of the most stringent, for very good reasons, ethics boards and SAPRA as well, in terms of its approval process. It's very stringent. So, it's really good to be able to start. WHO are thrilled, because in the past what happens is the only countries which participate in these trials are the high-income countries. And then you get answers which only apply to high-income countries, and we have to see if they extrapolate to us in the low and middle-income countries. So we're really proud to be able to be one of the low and middle-income countries which is participating, and we'll get answers which are directly applicable to our setting. I think I'll leave it there. I've spoken, I think, probably too long already, but I'm obviously totally happy to take any questions. Thanks, Tian.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. Colleagues, I can see that Professor Rees is on the line and has to jump off soon. Helen, if you have a few minutes more to spend with us, could you just give us in the next five minutes a broad overview of how you feel that the community engagement component of Solidarity has gone so far, and perhaps leave us with a thought on how you would like to see civil society and advocates engaged to ensure the success of the trial?
Well, I'll start at a sort of higher kind of global level of the discussions of civil society. And in fact, I apologize, I'm jumping off for an urgent vaccine call around vaccine access that the ministers asked for. But if I start at that really high global level, I can promise you that from where we started, in every meeting and every structure that's being put in place, and I'm thinking about the vaccine structures like the COVAX facility and so on, the call for civil society to have strong engagement has just got stronger and stronger. And the obvious need for that in terms of acceptability of research, acceptability of new technology. I think that I've been on many boards and committees now where you can see people's eyes opening and saying, okay, I'm beginning to get this in a way that I think at the beginning wasn't understood. Just one thing for Solidarity that I think is really important is that we a lot of focus early on, as with the Solidarity trial, went on treating the most seriously ill patients. And there's very obvious reasons for that, because you want to save lives at the end of the sickest patients. But the other thing just to remember is that if we can reduce mortality and morbidity, not only do we reduce the burden on the hospitals, but very importantly, you change the dynamic for considerations of things like lockdown. If we can start to, and we heard the minister say, with just the use of dexamethasone, we've reduced mortality by 25 to 30% in ICUs in South Africa. If we can start to bring that mortality down and down and down and get it down to, we won't be able to get rid of it completely, but if, say, it becomes, with different interventions, that the sort of things we're testing, it becomes more like a a seasonal flu mortality that we live with as societies. We accept every year that seasonal flu will affect certain people with pre-existing diseases more than others, and there will be a global mortality associated with it. We're not happy about it, and we keep trying to find better and better vaccines, but we accept it. The point about this is if we can pull this down, we change the dialogue. It's because it's so unpredictable and has still got a high mortality that we're still having to push back into lockdown. And as you say, when you push back into these restrictions, what you do is you change the socioeconomic structure of society, and that affects very often the poorest communities more than anything else. So what I'm saying is it's not just clinically good to save lives, but it actually changes the dynamic of this disease if we can get better treatments at that end. For civil society engagement, we've had obviously some engagement, and a trial like this is a bit different to, what many of us are used to, which are the large community-based HIV, say, prevention trials or treatment trials. This is different because it's in, the sort of the inner circle of a hospital, is in the sickest people in a hospital who are removed because of the infectiousness. So working out an acceptable engagement for civil society is somewhat different to what we might have been used to with these big population-based HIV studies. But so that's why I think we're very open to exploring it. And at the very least, all of these sites have got community structures. The ethics committee should have community representation. And these kinds of ongoing dialogues are something that we can do, and we can share the outcomes with you. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Helen. Colleagues, I think now we're going to go into the pre-submitted questions that we'll ask Professor Nel to address, and then we'll go straight into your questions in the chat box. So we'll ask Professor Nel just to unmute himself again. And so, Jeremy, we've heard from Helen and indeed yourself that the trial regards community engagement as important. I know certainly the organizations, movements, and coalitions, one of which alone just represents over 130,000 community structures across the country, are all really eager to learn and hear from you your thoughts on how civil society can engage with this trial beyond CAB structures existing. And we've certainly had discussions between ourselves in terms of do the communities wear this trial around the hospitals? Do they know a trial is taking place? We've had discussions, I know I've shared with yourself and Helen as well, our thoughts around the fact that as advocates, we're really passionate about ensuring that communities beyond CABs are involved from a protocol development stage to post-trial access if it comes to that. And we know that in this particular trial, the protocol was, for all intents and purposes, set in advance by the WHO, and then countries had to adopt this protocol to ensure uniformity. And please feel free to correct me if my understanding of the process is flawed. So our understanding was that the protocol was already in place and that it would roll out. And so what work has the trial done to ensure beyond CABs that communities are engaging with solidarity that is happening in their own neighborhood? And if not, how do you envision what Helen described as almost a new learning process for us as civil society to rethink community engagement in the context of this particular, the way Helen characterized, unique trial?
Yep, thanks very much. Yeah, so just to confirm what you said, so in this case, there are over 40 countries participating in Solidarity. The protocol is developed by WHO's executive committee kind of centrally. So the protocol has to be identical across all sites in every country. So as you rightly said, there really isn't any scope to change the protocol. At least in any sort of meaningful sense, we've added other layers of monitoring to it, which we're allowed to do. But in terms of the core protocol, it has to remain constant. In fact, sorry, let me just put my video on. I forgot about that as well. So yeah, so that is one of the challenges of this sort of trial, is that it's very, you know, it's not, we're not able to change the core protocol. The other thing, of course, is the pandemic scenario where, you know, this is happening during lockdown, where it's not only very difficult, but potentially dangerous and potentially even unethical to go into communities and in a way that we'd normally do, you know, in terms of sort of community engagement structures. This sort of method of doing it electronically and on Zoom offers somewhere around that, you know, in the sense that it's a way to engage without, you know, while still being socially distanced. But it does, as I'm sure you'd be the first to appreciate, Tiana, it does limit it as well. You know, whenever you have this sort of thing, it's only a subset of the community who will log on to a Zoom meeting. And it makes it very, very difficult to sort of have detailed community engagement with it. And also, you know, it's also difficult in the sense that, as you said, it's limited in the scope of what the community engagement, you know, can achieve, other than really sort of information sharing, which is vital, clearly, and also the ability to answer concerns and address as many concerns as are raised. So we've dealt with, you know, by really engaging with as broadly as we can imagine on this, but you know, we're happy to take suggestions. I mean, yeah, I think that, you know, we're all learning in this kind of way, this really difficult COVID-19 pandemic lockdown type scenario. How to engage more broadly outside sort of Zoom meetings with community advisory boards and community leaders elsewhere.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And also, just to take you up on that, I think certainly this collective has been increasingly frustrated with the research landscape in general. Like you say, in terms of the urgency of trying to obtain answers in terms of COVID. And I think we're really excited and we're ready and we're eager to continue the specific discussion with you in terms of how we can use our existing platforms that we've used even during the pandemic to actively ensure that the communities where the research happens are at the very minimum aware and have a basic understanding of the trial. Jeremy, if you could for a moment just unpack the issue of the consenting process of a hospitalized patient. I think a lot of the human rights advocates of the call, including myself, you know, our ears immediately go up and say, what does that mean? What does it mean for rights and for agency? What does it mean for a next of kin to consent on your behalf? You have indicated that that is certainly the exception. But in that event, what kind of human rights and ethics environment would govern or influence a next of kin, for example, consenting a patient onto the trial? And then in the second instance, what does the general, or maybe we should start with that. Could you unpack the general consenting process of a hospitalized patient? And then in the second instance, the ethical implications of a next of kin providing consent?
Sure. It's a very, very good question. So the ability to enroll hospitalized patients in many sorts of trials clearly is vital. And in COVID-19, it's especially important because people who don't require hospitalization generally don't require treatment, you know, in the sense of, I mean, you may take Panado if you have a fever, but you don't require antiviral treatment, or you don't require, you know, even dexamethasone or things like that, because you are going to be fine. So the landscape for intervening in COVID-19 is really limited to people who are hospitalized, for at least for the vast majority of cases. And so that's why it's really important to be able to do research in hospitalized patients. And of course, this is not unprecedented. There's many types of, you know, many research projects occur in hospitalized patients. Although in things like HIV and TB, we're fortunate that we're able to enroll mostly outpatients because, you know, the patient population is so much more well. So in terms of what happens with the hospitalized patients, so we have, you know, very experienced trial teams which are running these projects and which are you know, apply really the sort of the highest ethical standards about this sort of thing. So that the patient will be, so firstly, we make sure the patient is not in obvious distress or anything like that. So we try not to enroll people until they're a bit more stable. So you can imagine really the sort of person who might be on an oxygen mask, but is otherwise feeling okay on that oxygen mask. So that's the sort of patient we try and enroll. We're not trying to enroll people who are in kind of medical distress, because that's really, you know, that would raise all sorts of other issues which we don't want to sort of traverse. So this is a patient who's doing okay but requires hospitalization. They get given an information sheet, they get talked, and they make sure that firstly that they're very competent in their own in one of the languages which we offer. So we go through the consent process in the local, depending on the site, but in the local languages. So most sites have the ability to have counselors and people who enroll and are fluent in at least 3 languages. We make sure that the patient themselves is fluent in one of those languages. If there's a language barrier, again, that's not somebody we can consent, and we should be consenting, because again, it's very important that the patient understands it. There's an information sheet that they go through, and they talk to the patient about the trial. They assess whether the patient is willing to enroll in this trial once they understand more about the trial and what's required. They do a test of the comprehension of that. In other words, so as they, when they make sure that the patient understands what's going on towards the end, and only really at the end of that process, and that process may take 20 minutes, 30 minutes, even longer potentially, to make sure that all the questions the patient has answered are answered. And then if the patient is willing to engage in the trial beyond that point, then they go ahead and randomize the patient to one of those arms. But it's quite a lengthy process. It's like I said, it's very experienced trial teams. Involves a lot of kind of information given to the patient in a way that's accessible. And remember, the information sheet goes through each of the ethics boards to make sure that it's comprehensive, but also comprehensible. So make sure it's not too detailed in using too much jargon, and it's really aimed at at lay people to make sure that they're getting the information they need. It's only really at the end of that point, when patient is satisfied that they understand everything about the trial, that they have no more questions, and that they're willing to proceed, that they go ahead and randomize beyond that. Obviously, the patients are free to say no at any stage. And like I said, we're also selective in who we choose. We don't choose people who are too medically unwell, where we worried about their ability to sort of meaningfully consent, because someone who's desperate and very severely ill, that's perhaps not the best frame of mind to be enrolling in a trial. Thanks, Jan.
Absolutely, thanks. And also just a recognition, I think in terms of these webinars that we're having, it's a recognition that Solidarity is providing at its own cost PPE to healthcare workers, which I think is really commendable. I mean, ourselves on this group have had an interesting relationship, as you might have seen, with the BCG revaccination trial, and really our understanding of standard of care and the ethical imperative that trials should procure and provide PPE to any healthcare workers related to the trial, and certainly not put additional pressure on an already strained system. So a recognition of that. Jeremy, I just want to deal with some of the questions that have been submitted. Simba Takuva has said, does this adaptive design allow you to add drugs not in the protocol? Should studies elsewhere suggest an efficacy signal?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So we certainly can't add drugs ourselves that are not in the protocol, but WHO itself can decide to add arms, yes. That would be a protocol amendment, and we'd go through all the various regulatory approvals again. That's certainly something they consider. So, adaptive trials can remove arms or add arms. We, of course, at the local level can't decide to add our own drugs, in terms of the study. But remember that Solidarity also does work around whatever the standard of care is. And that's really essential, because it means that we can ensure that whatever the background drugs are that work, something like dexamethasone is a good example, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, really does help people on oxygen. It's not a problem for anyone to be on dexamethasone in Solidarity, unlike some other trials, which, you can't do it if you only take the trial drugs. In Solidarity, it works around whatever the standard of care is. So if the standard of care changes and improves, that's brought on board to Solidarity. But in terms of adding drugs for the purposes of studying them, we can't do that, but WHO may decide to do that, in which case we would go through all the regulatory approvals to make sure that that's okay on our side.
Yeah, great, thanks for that. Wolford has asked, given that patients will be quite sick in hospital, how will the study ensure their consent for the trial is informed and adequate? I think you've uncovered that sufficiently, thank you. And Tando asks, how does planning for success and adequate rollout in all of these trials look? And what does that involve? I imagine he's speaking here specifically around Solidarity. And what does that involve? As well as how do you feel civil society should influence that part of the process?
So, sorry, I just missed a bit of it. So it was planning for success and rollout.
So firstly, how do you plan for success, and then adequate rollout? And then the third part of that question is then what, in your view, is civil society's role? Because I'm sure you appreciate we come from a history in research where we basically consulted when the product is ready to roll. And obviously we've done a lot of work to ensure that changes. So yeah, that question in 3 parts, if you would.
Sure. So in terms of the success, so I mean, Tess is our national coordinator, she's on the phone call. She will be hopefully smiling, hopefully not crying in the background, but it's an enormous logistics issue to get 15 different sites across the country up and running. I'm not aware of another trial in South Africa which has done that anytime recently in terms of the scale and the breadth and the, each, it's one, if we were doing say 15 sites in Gauteng, it would be a lot easier because you would have one ethics board to go through, for example. But if we deliberately decided to go and make sure all corners of the country were covered, but that really made it a lot more difficult logistically. So it's a huge process in terms of getting approval from the hospitals, in terms of getting approval from the sites, the ethics board that the hospital falls under, the provinces, and then SAPRA overall. So there's at least 4 kind of sets of approvals that are required. Lots of training for the staff as well in terms of the pharmacists to make sure that they understand the protocol and we're adhering to the sort of best practice. Lots of training for the doctors and the study doctors and the study nurses to make sure that they're doing all the right stuff. So there's an enormous amount of planning that goes into this. And then, of course, getting and dispersing the drugs, because we get them from WHO for the most part, and then we send them out to the trial sites. It's another huge logistics issue. So there's a lot of planning that comes into it in terms of trying to make it, rolling it out in terms of the drugs. They shipped, so we get them from WHO and we ship them from VIT's RHI offices out to the sites as they're needed. So there's a lot of kind of planning and logistics that go around the back of this. And I think something that, even though we anticipated would be difficult, caught us a bit off guard in terms of just the scope of it. And then in terms of kind of community, how to involve the community. So I think solidarity is a bit different, as we mentioned, because of the fixed nature of the protocol. But I think one key thing is that when we do have findings from solidarity in any direction, in other words, if we find this drug works, or it works in this way but not that way, or it doesn't work when we need to drop it, I think that's a key point which community engagement becomes critical, because it's really important. The value of these trials is in direct proportion to the ability to spread the knowledge that's gained from these trials. And we can spread it within the medical community, but we really want the whole community, not just the medical community, but the communities around each of these sites and beyond, to get as much information as soon as we know anything. And I think that's a critical kind of inflection point that I would want to see us work on when there is changes, when there are changes to solidarity, to explain why and to get that information to the communities to empower them, really. So we've seen, for example, in dexamethasone, that the messaging hasn't been all that great. It's not clear, do you take it only in hospital, do you take it outside hospital, who benefits, who doesn't? And that's something within solidarity, if the drugs change and if we get firm answers on them, that we really want to make sure that the communities are aware of as possible, and we get kind of happy to field questions for as long as it takes to make sure that the information is spread as broadly as possible.
Absolutely, thank you. Colleagues on this call will remember we've had discussions around the spread of COVID-19 within healthcare facilities and healthcare associated infections. Yumna is asking, how would you manage those infections during the trial, infections that take place within a facility or hospital-acquired infections? And I would imagine, would those be any different to how you would treat any other potential patient?
Yes, so a good question. So there's 2 aspects to it. One is the spread of COVID-19 between patients in the trial. So we are obviously enrolling people who already have COVID-19, so they can't get it, they're not the receiving end of COVID-19 from the hospital. But obviously a key aspect is, and why we wanted to be so sure about the PPE, is that really does protect spread. So if you are wearing PPE as the trial nurse or the trial doctor interacting with patients on the trial, it protects you as the trial nurse and trial doctor, but it also protects other people and other doctors and nurses and other patients from getting COVID-19. So that's a kind of key aspect of preventing COVID-19 spread from our enrolled people to other patients. And then the other aspect is other nosocomial infections, other hospital infections. In other words, how would, if while the patients are hospitalized, what if they get a pneumonia that's not COVID, from another patient? That we would treat according to the best standard of care we'd normally treat, as you suggested, Tian. So it wouldn't be different to any other nosocomial pneumonia, say, treatment. the patients would get the highest standard of care they would if they got that from any other patient. And it's just worthwhile mentioning again that Solidarity doesn't keep people in hospital longer than they need to be medically. So even if the course is, say, 10 days of Remdesivir, the patient's well enough by day 4 to go home, they go home, and we keep, we stop them there in terms of the Remdesivir. So it's a key way of making sure they don't get exposed to the hospital environment for longer than they need to. And that's important for freeing up hospital beds, but it's also important for preventing them from getting hospital-acquired infections.
Great, thanks for that. Jeremy, could you, one of the last questions, speak to the involvement of people with HIV within the trial insofar as potential participants?
Sure, it's a very good question. So it's one of the key advantages of doing the trial in a country like South Africa is that, we want to know what these drugs do in an HIV population. But that question is really not going to be answered well by a lot of the rest of the world. So you do need to enroll people who have HIV and other opportunistic infections similar to that. So HIV is not a contraindication to the trial. In other words, we can enroll HIV positive patients. And that, like I said, I view as a strength, obviously. So, of course, if they have other reasons, with HIV not to be enrolled, such as they have kidney disease or bad liver disease or something, that's a different story. But a reasonably well HIV positive patient can be part of this trial. And that's really going to be important because I think that we will contribute the most in terms of knowledge about HIV and COVID, in terms of Solidarity, more than any other of the participating countries.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And Thando is asking a follow-up question to his initial question. He's raising concerns around the process that you've described, sounding as if it has the potential to additionally drain an already frail healthcare system. He's saying, my question, to be clear, was more on a successful rollout for when the trials give a positive result as a trial outcome. What specific policy in terms of drug purchasing and delivery of these products what discussions have you had with key people? And I guess as another follow-up to that question, could you unpack the role of pharma in this particular trial? And then his last question, sorry, I know I'm going on, is what is the clinician society involvement in all of this and how does it contribute to the success? So practically, what happens when we get a positive trial outcome in terms of access, purchasing, delivery, and then secondly, the clinician society involvement?
Yeah, thanks. Those are good questions. And sorry, I think I missed the gist of your first question. So let's see if I can take a better crack at it. So this trial is different from, say, an HIV trial where, in an HIV trial, for example, if you were put on trial regimen A and it works, there really is an obligation to make sure that you're able to access that drug off the trial. And that's what most responsible drug companies do, now. The post-trial access to that drug is important. Remember, this is a bit different in the COVID-19 epidemic where you only require access to this drug as an individual for that duration, the 6 to 10 days, depending on which arm you're done. So, for example, if you get your 6 days, there's no benefit to continuing that drug afterwards. So really what post-trial drug access means in this setting is really accessing it for other people who are not on the trial, rather than who are on the trial, who obviously do get their access. So in that setting, it requires really, that would be, that's to potentially millions of people in South Africa as well. And that requires the Department of Health really to be on board with that. They are on board, and it's interesting in, for example, something like Remdesivir's case. So Remdesivir for the Department of Health is interested in, but seeing as it costs a lot of money, it costs about 7,000 to 10,000 Rand for a course. And the patients at the moment, all we're sure of from the trials is that it reduces hospital stay by a few days. The Department of Health doesn't view that as a good purchase in terms of rolling it out to the rest of the country. However, if Solidarity were to show that it reduces mortality, in other words, that it saves lives, then Department of Health have said they will look very strongly at it again and decide again whether or not it is worth, despite the cost, purchasing it for the sort of population as a whole. So that's where Solidarity would interface with it, in the sense that if you find positive or negative results, it really feeds into the level of evidence that the Department of Health requires in terms of the state sector. Private sector is a different beast, as you know. They will purchase, they're able to purchase these drugs as needed for their own use, but it's, again, they're taking a chance in that sense because it's outside of the clinical trial monitoring environment, and it's also not clear whether or not these drugs are saving lives. That's what Solidarity is aiming to prove. So it's a very different beast. In terms of the in terms of the drug company's role in this, so with interferon and with the other drugs, which were part of Solidarity before they were dropped, they're very commonly available drugs, and many generic manufacturers make them. And so WHO purchases them and provides them for our sites. So they don't we don't deal directly with drug companies in terms of that. Remdesivir is a little bit of an exception because it's manufactured only by Gilead at the moment in terms of the original project. And so WHO have to interface with Gilead to purchase enough drug for that purpose. There is a possibility of getting some of the generic manufacturers into the Solidarity, and that's something we're looking at to really make sure that we have enough access within the trial. So the drug companies don't have anything to do with the protocol design. They don't sponsor the trial in any way. But obviously, WHO has to interface with them to obtain the drugs themselves. Thanks, Tian.
Great, thanks. The last part of his question was around the Clinician Society.
Oh, sorry. Do you mean the HIV Clinician Society? Or
he's just close to the Clinician Society. So
there's a couple of Clinician Society. HIV Clinician Society doesn't have a direct role in the in Solidarity. They are supportive of it, but I think they're as interested in anyone in terms of the effect of HIV in this COVID epidemic. But they're not directly involved in this trial.
Great, thanks for that. A last question from our side is that we know that in June, George Washington University School of Medicine spoke about the potential benefit of Remdesivir before people come into the ICU. And we know currently, and I speak under correction, that there's no oral Remdesivir. And so what are your thoughts around that, around Remdesivir before hospital?
It's a very good question, but you've hit the nail on the head. The problem is that there's no form of it that's not given by intravenously. So there's no way of easily accessing therapy for outpatients. Like I said, so where it becomes challenging because 95+% of outpatients who don't require hospitalization do fine anyway. So you would. The benefit of Remdesivir would be limited to quite a small subset of people who would later have been hospitalized. What we do in Solidarity, though, is we're able to give it as soon as they hit the hospital door before they require ICU. So anybody who's admitted, even if they have mild disease, but if they're in hospital, we're able to potentially get you Remdesivir, if you randomize to that arm, of course. But it's long before ICU. So I think that benefit is retained. But getting it as an outpatient, I don't see an easy way to do that anywhere in the world, really. Because of the fact that, exactly as you said, that it's only available really as an intravenous infusion. So you'd require a nurse and a drip and things like that, which is not something which you could do easily at home.
Great. The absolutely last question, I promised before we wrap up at the top of the hour. Any remarks or messages to us on the controversy of hydroxychloroquine?
Yeah. Thank you very much. So it's unfortunate in the sense that it became a bit political, and it's become a bit political really in the USA, not here. And so, the history of it was that it was one of the drugs which seemed promising in the beginning based on lab data, but needed to be tested in patients in high quality trials. So it was one of the drugs that Solidarity was enrolling, was including in its initial protocol. What happened with time was that the initial studies, which were not high quality, some of them showed benefit, some of them did not show benefit, some of them showed harm, some of them showed no harm. And that's the typical problem with with doing not great quality research, is that you end up with a sort of mess and no clear answer. 2 trials did, enrolled people, in the highest quality of evidence, these randomized controlled trials. And that was really the Recovery trial in the UK, which was kind of a sister trial of Solidarity, very similar methods, slightly different drugs. And Solidarity itself. And what happened was the Recovery trial was the first to enroll enough people to definitively say, based on the best quality evidence, this really isn't helping. It didn't help in terms of saving lives. In fact, there was a suggestion it may have increased mortality potentially, although that's less clear. It certainly wasn't saving lives. It wasn't saving you from getting on a ventilator, and it wasn't saving you any days in hospital. And then when Solidarity looked at its interim data as well, it showed the same thing. Almost exactly the same thing as Recovery. So again, wasn't saving lives, wasn't reducing hospital stay, and wasn't keeping you out of a ventilator. And so really, when you put these 2 really big trials together with the highest quality evidence, I think pretty much most people, most clinicians in the world are convinced that this drug really doesn't, unfortunately, offer the benefits which we hoped it might in the beginning. What's happened, though, of course, is that you've got the Trump factor in the USA, where he put a lot of personal credibility on the line, saying this is a wonder drug, well beyond where the evidence was at that stage. And then it's become a bit politicized there, so you get a lot of pros and cons. I'm confident as a doctor, even outside of Solidarity. If I was not in Solidarity, I would say the same thing, that I would not recommend it for patients with COVID-19. I think that we have good evidence that it doesn't work. And in some cases may be harmful. So I think the jury is pretty much in on this one, but the controversy persists well beyond the evidence, and I think mostly for political reasons.
Great, thank you so much. Colleagues, that was Professor Jeremy Nel. He, along with Professor Helen Rees, is the co-principal investigator of the Solidarity trial. Prof. Nel, we will be in touch over the next week or two to finalize the post-call summary, as well as really try and pin down some concrete actions in which this particular collective can support the work of the trial. Thank you again for your time, and thank you, colleagues, for joining. Apologies from the interim CEO of the South African National AIDS Council. We will work to get her on one of our upcoming. Stay tuned to our social media channels. Thank you again, everyone, and have a good Thursday further.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks.